My name is Walter Kowalski, and at 63 years old, I thought I'd seen enough of life to know better. I'd buried my wife, raised my kids, built something from nothing with my own two hands, and I still managed to be fooled by a woman who smiled at me over a cup of coffee at a hardware store in Sudbury, Ontario, on a Tuesday morning in October. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should start by telling you what I never told her. What I never told anyone outside of my accountant, my lawyer, and my two grown children. For the better part of 18 years, I've been going to work every morning at Kowalski & Sons Building Supply, the largest independent building supply company between Sudbury and Salt Sweet. Marie wearing the same steel-toed boots I've worn since I was 35, driving the same used pickup truck I bought second-hand in 2019, and eating lunch at the same Tim Hortons on LaSalle Boulevard where a double-double costs the same as it did a decade ago. My employees think I'm the warehouse operations manager. My neighbors think I'm a widower who works too hard and doesn't take enough vacations. And until 11 months ago, the woman I was planning to marry thought I was a man of very modest means, living carefully on a foreman's salary, grateful for every dollar. She was wrong about all of it. The company is mine. Every square foot of the warehouse, every delivery truck, every contract with every contractor from here to Espanola, all of it. My late wife Diane and I built it together starting in 1991 when we had nothing but a second mortgage on our house and a stubborn belief that Sudbury needed a good local supplier who wouldn't treat tradespeople like inconvenience. When Diane passed from ovarian cancer in 2017, I kept the name Kowalski & Sons because my son Patrick and my daughter Marie Claire both have shares in the business, and because changing it felt like erasing her. I kept coming to work in my boots because the alternative was sitting at home alone with her photograph and a bottle of rye, and I wasn't ready to do that. I kept my ownership quiet because I'd learned, slowly and painfully, that money changes how people see you. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it's subtle. The way a conversation shifts when someone finds out what you're worth. The way people stop telling you hard truths. The way certain kinds of people start finding you very interesting all of a sudden. So I kept my head down, worked alongside my staff, and let most of the world believe I was just Walter from the warehouse. That's the life I was living when I met Deborah. She was looking at weather stripping in the retail section of our store, holding two different products up to the light and frowning at them like they'd personally offended her. She was about my age. I later learned she was 61, with silver hair she wore, pulled back, and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked sensible and sharp and a little bit impatient. I liked her immediately. I told her the foam tape would compress too much over a Canadian winter, and she'd be replacing it by March. She laughed and asked if I worked there. I said I did. She bought the rubber seal instead, shook my hand, and walked out. I thought about her for 3 days. On the Friday, I drove past a cafe on Elm Street that I'd never been to, and saw her sitting in the window with a book. I'm not a man who does impulsive things. I parked the truck. I went in. I sat down 2 tables away, ordered a coffee, and tried to figure out how to start a conversation without seeming like I'd followed her. I hadn't. But I understood how it might look. She solved the problem for me. She looked up, recognized me, and said, "Weather stripping man." I said yes. She asked if the seal was working. I said I hadn't installed it. She had. She laughed again. That laugh was going to be a problem for me. Her name was Deborah Ashworth. She was recently retired from a 25-year career as an administrator with the Sudbury Catholic District School Board. She had 1 adult daughter, a son-in-law, and 2 grandchildren who lived in Barrie. She'd been divorced for 14 years. She owned a tidy bungalow on Notre Dame Avenue, drove a sensible car, and spent her Friday mornings reading in cafes because she'd spent 30 years eating lunch at her desk, and she'd promised herself she was done with that. I told her my name was Walter, that I worked at a building supply company, that I had 2 kids and 2 grandkids, and a house out in Valcarin that was too big for one person. I told her my wife had passed 6 years ago. She said she was sorry. The way she said it was quiet and real, not performative. I noticed we had coffee that Friday, and then we had dinner the following Thursday, and by Christmas we were spending most weekends together. She met Patrick and Marie Claire in February, over a Sunday roast at my house. They liked her. They told me afterward that she seemed grounded and straightforward. Patrick said, "She doesn't seem like she's trying to impress anyone, Dad." That was the best thing he could have said. Through all of it, I told her what I always told people. I worked in warehouse operations. Good steady job. I'd been there a long time. I owned my house, had a bit saved, nothing extravagant. She nodded and never pushed further. She wasn't interested in my finances. She talked about her own pension, her own savings, her plans to do some traveling once her hip healed from a minor surgery she'd had in the fall. She split the bill at restaurants and got annoyed when I tried to cover it all. I was, for the first time since Diane died, genuinely happy. I proposed in April, on the dock at Ramsey Lake at sunset, with a ring I'd had made by a jeweler in the Makonnen building downtown. She said yes before I finished the sentence. She was crying and laughing at the same time, and she said, "You ridiculous man. Yes, obviously yes." We called the kids that night. Marie-Claire screamed with happiness. Patrick said, "Dad, I'm really glad. I slept better that night than I had in years." Then her daughter came to visit. Her daughter's name was Courtney. She was 34, pleasant enough on the surface, and she arrived from Barrie with her husband Kevin the first weekend of May with a bottle of wine and a lot of questions dressed up as conversation. The questions, I noticed, kept circling back to my finances. Not directly, not rudely, but they were there. What kind of company was it? Big operation? Did I have a pension? Was the house paid off? Had Diane's estate been settled years ago? Was there anything from that still outstanding? I answered simply and without detail. Modest job, modest savings, house is mine. Everything's been settled for years. Courtney smiled and talked about something else. After they left, Deborah said, "Sorry about that. Courtney worries. She just wants to make sure I'm taken care of." I said that was understandable, but I watched. The change in Deborah was slow and subtle. And I want to be careful here because I don't want to tell a story I don't have the evidence for. What I can tell you is what I observed. After Courtney's visit, Deborah started mentioning the future differently, not in a warm, planning our life together way, in a logistical way. She asked about the house in Val Caron. How large was it exactly? Did I have plans for it? Had I thought about what would make sense at our age in terms of property? She asked if I'd updated my will recently. She mentioned, more than once, that Courtney had suggested we each sit down with a financial planner, just to make sure everything was organized before the wedding. I listened to all of it and said very little. Then, on the third Saturday of May, 6 weeks after our engagement, I arrived at her house at 10 in the morning for what was supposed to be a day of yard work and lunch, and I found Courtney and Kevin already there, seated at the kitchen table, with a man I didn't recognize. There were papers on the table. The man had a briefcase. Deborah looked at me when I came in. Something crossed her face. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was more like calculation. "Walter," she said, "sit down. There's something we want to discuss with you." I sat down. The man with the briefcase introduced himself as a financial consultant. He had a pleasant handshake and a card I glanced at and then set on the table. Courtney leaned forward and began speaking in a warm, reasonable voice that I immediately understood was rehearsed. The gist of it was this. In preparation for our marriage, the family had been thinking about how to protect everyone's interests. Deborah had assets. I had assets. Rather than navigate the complexity of merging finances for two people our age, with grown children, existing estates, potential healthcare costs down the road, they had drawn up a proposal. I would transfer the title of my house in Val Caron into a joint holding, to be managed through a numbered company. Courtney's husband Kevin had already registered in Ontario. This would, the consultant explained smoothly, protect both of us. Ensure the property wasn't subject to probate. Allow us to live there together while shielding the asset. The papers were already drafted. There was a pen on the table. I looked at the papers. I looked at the consultant. I looked at Kevin, who was studying the table. I looked at Courtney, who was smiling. I looked at Deborah. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. "We just want to be practical, Walter," Courtney said. "I'm asking Deborah." Deborah looked at her hands. Courtney thought it would be a good idea to have everything sorted before. "How long?" I said again, quietly. She didn't answer. I picked up the papers and read them carefully. I'm not a lawyer, but I've been signing contracts for 30 years, and I know what transfer of title means, and I know what a numbered company means, and I know that Kevin, who I'd met 3 times, being the registered director of a company that would hold my house, meant that Kevin could, under certain circumstances, exert control over that property. The papers were well drafted. They were not simple. Someone had paid for them to be prepared. I set them back down. I appreciate the thought, I said, but I won't be signing anything today. Courtney's smile thinned. Walter, I understand it seems sudden, but this is really in everyone's interest. Then there's no rush, I said. If it's genuinely in everyone's interest, it'll still be a good idea next month. And the month after. The consultant started to say something. I looked at him calmly, and he stopped. I stood up. I said, Deborah, I'm going to give you some time with your family. Call me when you'd like to talk. I picked up my jacket. I walked out. I sat in my truck for about 4 minutes in her driveway. Then I called my lawyer. My lawyer's name is Sandra Furtado, and she's been handling my company's legal work for 11 years. She answers on the second ring for me. I described what had just happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then said, Walter, get me a copy of those papers. I told her I hadn't taken them. She said, then describe them to me exactly. I did, as precisely as I could remember. She listened and said, the numbered company registration, did you get the number or the name? I hadn't, but I remembered Kevin's last name. She said she'd look into it. Then she said, Walter, you know what I'm going to ask you? I said yes. She said, does she know? I said no. She was quiet again. Then, you need to decide what you want to do here, because this could be a lot of things. It could be an overprotective daughter who doesn't understand that what she's drawn up is effectively a transfer scheme. Or it could be something else. A pause. How well do you actually know this woman? That question stayed with me for the next 4 days. I want to be honest about those 4 days, because I think they're important. I didn't want to believe that Deborah knew what she was doing. I'd spent 14 months with her. I'd watched her refuse to let me pay for things, watched her get frustrated when I suggested something too expensive, watched her bring groceries to my house because she said it was unfair that I always cooked. I'd watched her grieve, in her quiet way, for the life she'd wanted and hadn't had. I believed she loved me. I also believed that Courtney was something Deborah didn't fully know how to refuse. Sandra called me back on the Wednesday. The numbered company had been registered in February, 2 months before I proposed. Kevin was the director. Courtney was a listed shareholder. The company's described purpose was real estate holding. February. I sat with that for a long time. That evening I drove to Deborah's house. She opened the door and looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read, something between relief and apprehension. I came inside. We sat in her living room. I didn't say anything for a minute. Then I said, the numbered company was registered in February, Deborah, 2 months before I proposed, before either of us had any reason to be organizing assets. She looked at the window. That means someone was planning this before we were even engaged, I said. Someone was expecting me to propose, and expecting that when I did, I would sign papers transferring my home to a company your son-in-law controls. She was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, Courtney said you were a simple man, Walter. She said she just wanted to make sure I was protected. Protected from what? I said. A simple man? She said men like you sometimes, later in life, they hide things, that you might not be what you seemed. I almost laughed. Deborah, I need to show you something. I handed her a single sheet of paper. It was a printout from the Ontario Business Registry, Kowalski and Sons Building Supply Limited. Sole voting shareholder, Walter M. Kowalski. She stared at it. I said, I'm not a warehouse operations manager. I'm the owner. I have been since 1991. The building, the fleet, the contracts, all of it. I let her read the page. I kept it quiet because I've kept it quiet for 30 years. Not to deceive you. Because I wanted to know who I was to people before they knew what I was worth. She looked up at me with an expression I will never completely forget. It was complicated. There was shame in it. There was something that might have been grief. There was also, I noticed, something that looked a lot like anger, and I wasn't sure if it was directed at Courtney or at me. You lied to me, she said. I didn't tell you everything, I said. There's a difference, and I'm willing to talk about whether that difference matters. But right now, I need you to be honest with me. Did you know about the company registration? Did you know it was set up in February? The silence stretched out. I knew Courtney was looking into things, she said finally. She told me she was getting advice. I didn't know the details, but you knew the papers would be waiting on your kitchen table that Saturday. A pause. Yes, I nodded slowly. I want you to understand something. I said. If you'd told me what was happening, if you'd come to me and said, Courtney is worried, she's pushing me to do this, I don't know how to handle it, I would have helped you. I would have called a lawyer and made sure your real interests were protected, properly, transparently, with both of our names on something fair. She was crying now, silently, looking at her hands. Instead, I said, I walked into a room with a consultant and pre-drafted papers and a pen on the table. And I don't know, Deborah, whether that was Courtney's plan that you got pulled along with, or whether you wanted the same thing she did and hoped I wouldn't notice. I love you, Walter, she said. I believe you might, I said. But I also know that love and honesty are not the same thing, and right now I'm missing the second one. I stood up. I told her I needed time to think. I told her I wasn't going to make a decision in her living room, with both of us, emotional. I drove home, and I sat in my kitchen in the dark for about an hour, and I thought about Diane, and about what she would have told me to do. She would have told me to stop being a romantic fool. She would have also told me to be fair. I tried to be both. Over the next 3 weeks, Sandra looked carefully into the numbered company, into Kevin's financial history, and into a few other things I'd asked her to look into. What she found painted a picture. Kevin had been named in a civil suit 4 years earlier, a property dispute in Barrie that had been settled out of court. Courtney had declared personal bankruptcy in 2018 and had been discharged in 2020. They had, according to what Sandra could trace through public records, accumulated significant debt since then. Deborah, I was quite certain, did not know any of this about her own daughter. I made an appointment to see Deborah on a Sunday afternoon. I brought Sandra's summary not to hurt her, but because I thought she deserved to know. I sat across from her at her kitchen table, the same table where the papers had been waiting for me 6 weeks earlier, and I told her what we'd found. She listened. She didn't interrupt. By the time I finished, she had stopped crying. She'd moved past that into something quieter and harder. She was using me, Deborah said. It wasn't a question. She may not have seen it that way, I said. But yes, the goal wasn't to protect you. If I'd signed those papers, Kevin would have had a directorship over a company holding a property he never earned. And in the event of anything happening to either of us, that company's assets would be subject to the director's decisions. Deborah sat very still. What would you like to do? I asked. She said she needed to talk to Courtney. I told her that was completely her right. I told her that whatever happened between her and her daughter was not mine to involve myself in. That was her family, her relationship, and her call entirely. She nodded. Then she looked at me directly and said, And us? I'd thought about this for 3 weeks. I think we got here too fast, I said. I think we're good together. Or we could be. But there's a conversation we should have had months ago that we skipped, and a trust I had that got broken, and those things need time. I looked at her. I'm not walking away, but I'm not proposing again tomorrow either. She said she understood. She asked if she could return the ring. I told her to keep it for now. She started to protest, and I said, Keep it. We'll figure out what it means later. I left her house feeling tired and sad, and underneath both of those things, something that took me a while to identify. It was clarity, the kind you can only get after something difficult has been examined all the way through. Courtney, when Deborah confronted her, denied everything for about 20 minutes, and then began to cry and said she had only been trying to help and that the debt was just temporary, and that she had been terrified of her mother ending up with nothing. Deborah called me that evening and relayed all of it, her voice flat and exhausted. I listened. The numbered company was dissolved the following month. Kevin, to his credit, did it without argument. Once Deborah made clear, she understood what had been attempted. As for Deborah and me, we took 4 months apart, mostly. We had coffee twice during that time, cordial and careful. She started seeing a therapist, which she mentioned without embarrassment, and which I thought was a brave thing to do. She had some hard conversations with Courtney. Slowly, I understood. She was learning what her daughter's life actually looked like. The debt, the stress, the way fear had led to a scheme that Courtney had probably convinced herself was justified. I did my own thinking. I talked to Patrick and Marie Claire. Marie Claire, who has never once in her life let me feel sorry for myself, sat across from me in my kitchen in Valcarin and said, Dad, do you think she knew the whole plan, or do you think she got pulled into it? I said honestly that I believed it was somewhere in between and that I wasn't sure the answer changed what I felt. She said, "The question is whether you trust her now." Not then, now. She poured us both a coffee and waited. I thought about it. The thing about trust is that it isn't binary. It's not present or absent. It's built, over time, out of repeated choices. What Deborah had done or allowed to happen was let her daughter's panic override her own judgment, at least for a window of time. That was a failure. It was also, I came to believe, a human one. The question Marie Claire was really asking was whether I believed Deborah was capable of making different choices going forward. Whether the version of her that had sat quietly in that room with the papers on the table was the whole of who she was, or whether it was a chapter. In October, nearly 6 months after that Saturday in May, Deborah called and asked if she could come by. She arrived on a Thursday evening with a container of butter chicken from a place on Paris Street that I'd mentioned once, months ago, was my favorite. She'd remembered. She set it on the counter and turned to me and said, without any preamble, "I should have told you what Courtney was planning. I was afraid of how you'd see me, afraid you'd think I'd encouraged it. So I said nothing and let it happen, and that was wrong. And I'm sorry. No performance. No extensive explanation. Just the thing itself." I served the butter chicken. We ate at my kitchen table and talked for 3 hours. About Diane, which I don't often do. About her marriage, and why it had failed, and what she'd learned from it. About Courtney, who was in the process of dealing with her debts, honestly, for the first time in years. About getting older and being scared and making bad decisions because you're scared. At the end of the evening, she stood in my front hall and said, "I'm not asking for anything, Walter. I just needed you to know that I understand what I did." I held the door open and said, "Same time next Thursday?" She looked at me for a moment like she was checking whether I meant it. I meant it. "We're taking it slowly. There are no papers on any tables. Sandra has drafted a straightforward cohabitation agreement. When we get there, if we get there, that protects both of us, plainly and transparently, with both our names on it and both our lawyers having reviewed it. Deborah knows, now, what I own and what it means." She was quiet for a long time after I explained it fully. Then she said, "I would have loved you anyway, you know." I told her I was starting to believe that. She said, "Good, start faster. I'm not going to tell you that everything is simple now, because it isn't. We're two people in our 60s carrying 60 years each of experience and choices and loss, trying to build something honest on ground that had a crack in it. That takes work. But I'll tell you what I've learned, because I think it matters. If you are building a life with someone at any age, but especially past 60, when the stakes feel higher because the time feels shorter, do not let love be a reason to skip the hard conversations. Not about money, not about family, not about what your children know or want or fear. The most expensive thing you can do is assume that love makes the practical things irrelevant. It doesn't. It makes them more important, because there's more at stake. Background checks sound clinical and cold, but knowing who someone is, their financial history, their adult children's circumstances, the pressures they carry that they haven't mentioned is not a violation of romance. It is a basic act of self-respect. And if someone is right for you, that knowledge won't diminish them. It will give you something solid to stand on. Do not transfer title of anything you own into a company you did not create. Do not sign documents you haven't had reviewed by your own lawyer. And do not let the warmth of a new relationship convince you that there is no such thing as a conflict of interest. There is always such a thing. Recognizing it is not cynicism, it is wisdom. And finally, this one is harder to say. But I believe it. Sometimes the people we love make bad choices because they are afraid, not because they are bad. That doesn't erase the choice. It doesn't mean you have to stay, but it does mean that before you decide, it's worth asking whether what happened is the whole story, or just a terrible chapter in a longer one. I'm Walter Kowalski. I'm 63 years old. I drive a used pickup truck and eat lunch at Tim Hortons and go to work in steel-toed boots at a company that belongs entirely to me. And on Thursday evenings, I have butter chicken at my kitchen table with a woman who remembered what I said I liked, and who told me the truth when it cost her something to do it. That's enough. That's more than enough.